Hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the SafePath monthly webinar series. My name's Emma, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm on the marketing team here at SafePath, and I'm joined today by SafePath CEO Adil Khan, who will be talking about how we can mitigate business risks with spreadsheet controls. There will be a Q&A section at the end, so if you do have any questions, then feel free to send those over during the session in the control panel. And we'll discuss those at the end of the session today. So without further ado, Adil, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Emma. Thanks everybody for jumping on this our monthly webinar series. We're hopefully everybody's safe, working from home like I am today. So here's a quick introduction. We every month come up with some educational topic in our series of these webinars, been doing it for 10 plus years. And we picked the topic around spreadsheet risks this time because a number of our clients have recently reached out to us and asked us for assistance around doing a better job of auditing their controls through SafePath, as the customers are still working remotely in most of our regions where we service our customers across the 5 continents. So even though some regions are doing better than others, but enterprise customers are giving their employees the option to work from home as much as they can. And so spreadsheets have become a new risk all over again, right? Deja vu all over again, because spreadsheets have been used in finance from the beginning of my career anyways, and they're still a big part of it. And as we're working remotely, we're doing more and more work in spreadsheets and relying on the information that is in the spreadsheets to pass it along to our colleagues and coworkers to do their piece, eventually turning them into a product deliverable that management is using to make decisions. So we're focused on financial controls, as you can see in this agenda today, but we'll talk a little bit about high-level risk just to confirm our understanding with what you're seeing in your organizations. And really the part that I'm excited about talking today is the ability to mitigate risk. Just the lessons we have learned in the last 3 to 6 months of dealing with clients that have reported risks to us, and how we are helping them address those risks using mitigation techniques. And I've picked 5 different examples of different systems and so forth. So we'll spend more time on that, and then we'll close the session with a case study and a Q&A. So we'll talk a little bit about some recent work we've done for a client in the US to help them improve their audit. So just a quick intro on us. I think you can read most of this, but we've been doing thought leadership type events, and now more and more virtual events this year. For many years, written a book on this topic with our experiences, again, helping many customers and taking their input and building out best practices that we share with you through these webinars and publications, ebooks, and so forth. So please go to our resources page where we post webinars and also lots of other ebooks and other information that'll be helpful. And we normally would participate in the user groups this year. Obviously, a lot of that is done remotely, as you might imagine. Customers, just to give you an idea of what type of customers we service. So it's typically an enterprise customer that has more than 500 to 1,000 employees, and then ranging to Fortune 100 companies around the world. And we cover 8 or 10 major industry segments. You can see some of them here. Everything from government to life sciences and everything in between. And we have customers from a geographical perspective in many parts of the world on 5 continents. So a mixture of that helps us build these global best practices, which we're sharing today as well. So let's dig into the topic a little bit more. And again, this is just to level set, where we are today and what's changed since 2020. So a recent study of inherent risk in spreadsheets found that, despite us moving a lot of our information to digital systems and so forth, they continue to play a big role in compliance process. And that creates a risk by itself, because there are very few controls around spreadsheets, as we all know. So nearly 50% of the companies still rely on these spreadsheets for doing audits. And I can attest to my own customer base that I talk to, that even those with systems in place like SafePath will do some things on the side with spreadsheets. And so, it's an important piece of the audit story to build a picture of controls is to use spreadsheets. And so we can't get away from spreadsheets. They're here, and we got to learn to live with them, just put better controls, as we'll show you in a minute. So what are the spreadsheet risks that our customers are reporting to us? These are the top 5 issues that we have discovered in the recent months, and even going back a few years. I guess this hasn't changed a whole lot. Maybe the priorities shifted, but it's the same risk we see. So lack of clear ownership. When the spreadsheet, who enters what cell of data, and where does that go next? So I work a lot in the finance side of the organization. So financial close process is close to me. So for example, at the month end or period end close, there are folks that will enter pieces of the closed puzzle, and then I'll pass it on to the next person as part of a checklist, and they'll enter their piece. And so that's an example of ownership issue, right? You can do the same for resource planning, demand generation, etc., sales. And what we find is, even though people have spreadsheets have been around a long time, and people have skills, especially in the organizations we work with, to do the sufficient amount of work, but it's when you're trying to use formulas and logic and data, when you combine all that, the skills required to manage that gets a little bit harder, and not everybody in the organization has the same level of skills. So we see that creates a risk, right? Because if not everybody is up to speed on some macro or formula you're using to drive a financial reporting number, that can cause misstatement risks. And that's been a concern of our customers, escalated concern, should I say, over the last few months. There are generally there are not good policies and procedures around spreadsheet controls, although we see customers documenting, some policies and controls. The challenge is that because they are so flexible, which is why we love using them, it's hard to determine if, those policies are effectively being complied to, because it's hard to gather the evidence. Also, they don't have as much data reuse, right? So when we build something in a spreadsheet, we typically cut and paste that from one spreadsheet to the next one. So if I'm a VP of sales, I might take my region's sales numbers and cut and paste them, roll them up into my national numbers, right? And so those kinds of examples exist throughout the enterprise. And one of the things we're seeing auditors request their customers do more often, especially the big 4 audit firms we work with, is the customers are being asked to provide the evidence that the source from which the numbers were driven are correct, right? So the numbers, just because they're on a spreadsheet, are not something that the auditors are relying on, especially this year, with so much work being done offline and away from the office. So we're seeing this concept of provided by client, PPC, really take off, where if you provide some data in a spreadsheet, you also have to provide screenshots of the source of that data and confirmation that that data mapped. So for example, if I'm putting some journal entries together and I'm sending those in a spreadsheet as topside entries, I've got to be able to show the source general ledger system aware that the screenshot, at a minimum. And you can imagine that level of audit and scrutiny that might go through in order to verify the results. Again, final step would be around the security and the change control of the spreadsheet. Just because they're so flexible, we can easily change data and so forth. There's no error tracking or change tracking in the spreadsheets. So these are some common examples. You may have many more, and we have some question and answer at the end, but feel free to put your comments in the box of things that you're seeing in your business and what you'd like us to do to help address those. So a consequence of these errors is significant, and we know that from a finance background, that the impact of misreporting financial results is catastrophic on most organizations, and it's usually rated like that in your risk control matrix. But unfortunately, it continues to happen. These are some recent studies of organizations that have significant misstatement, financial misstatement otherwise. So most recently, there's this company in UK that lost 500 million in their market cap because their shares essentially went worthless because of errors that were made in the financial reporting aspect. And that's what we're going to cover in detail today to highlight the importance and impact of Spreadsheet. There's a Canadian company called Alta that we have followed in the past, where some cut and paste errors basically created a numbering problem in a cell of worth 24 million. And it's a Canadian power generator, so very conservatively well-managed business. And they ended up paying significant more for the hedging cost because they were hedging their consumption of resources to ensure mitigation on price fluctuations, right? So they ended up miscalculating the hedge. And then finally, the example of London Olympics, where just a simple pricing error made by a clerk in an inventory item around tickets resulted in a significant impact of this event in the London Olympics. So it's operational risk, it's financial risk, it's reputational risk, I guess. So many different ways spreadsheets are impacting, and it's getting worse with us working more and more on spreadsheets. So as we deal with the pandemic. So I'll dig in on one area because of limited time, we can't get into everything, but let's take a look at financial risk, which is what we're most familiar with, and that's where our customers are reaching out to us as they're going through their audits in 2020. And so I wanted to just highlight some of the things that we've heard, and especially around the close process. So I'll sort of go from top left down in a counterclockwise manner to point out some of these lessons learned, if you will. So we're finding out that spreadsheets are being used to record journal entries. I kind of talked about it already. And they're being used more often to prepare those special entries that you're having to make because of your change of business climate, let's say. So you may be writing off some inventory or an asset that you were not planning to do. And those entries are typically not system generated nicely from a subledger and accounting system. So those spreadsheets are becoming a root cause of some of the misstatement risks or audit risks, audit area. So whether it's an asset or inventory price list, so forth, that you're adjusting for this environment using spreadsheets to do that, and loading that into a accounting system or exporting it from an accounting system or an ERP system. So that's a common risk that we've heard in the period end process. Spreadsheets are being used during the close process to include consolidation. So as we're looking to report financial results, you may have systems across different business units, and they're all reporting their results, and then you're consolidating them in your consolidation spreadsheets. Now you may be using systems, consolidation systems and tools like Hyperion, and so they have their own pieces of risk, which we also handle, and sometimes the data even in those consolidation tools is loaded from an ERP system using spreadsheets, or parts of that data like topside entries are processed through there. So where customers are reporting that the spreadsheets used in the close process and consolidation process causing some scrutiny from the audit, as well as risks that they're identifying in their own internal audit. And then down here on my bottom right corner, journal entries imported into general ledger. Now that's a very common risk. I worked most of my professional career with Oracle. So Oracle has this tool called WebADI that we have used for many years. It's a very stable tool. But there are some challenges because you can change the profile options in Oracle, and you can bypass some of the validation of accounts, right? And so that can create a journal entry that might post into a account where it hides a liability or an asset, understates an asset. In any case, it can create a financial misstatement risk. And we are seeing our customers reach out to us and ask us to improve those controls around Web ADI in Oracle specifically. As I move up counterclockwise, spreadsheets used during the close process, including the consolidation process. I think I covered that one already. Spreadsheets used to develop financial statements. So I think that's kind of the net of this whole slide, is as your executives are getting ready to report results to the market or to other stakeholders. For example, we work with government organizations and so forth that have to comply with budgetary guidelines and utilize those budgets before their fiscal year. So those executives and their administrators that maintain the reporting are being asked to verify the results in the spreadsheet and tick and tie them all the way back to the source of that data along with their proof of reconciliation that's at the center of this close process from a preparer and reviewer's perspective. So these are some of the risks that have been elevated to us, and we're helping our customers address these risks, and we'll discuss some of those techniques in this session. So who is impacted with the risk of spreadsheets? So it's pretty widespread, and that's no surprise since everybody uses spreadsheets. So you can see that the people that create the spreadsheets are getting more pressure to make sure their data is correct. They're being scrutinized in audits, and facing that audit fatigue we all face as we come close to a period end. Risk managers, they're being asked to look at the risk of data across the board. And while I'm going to focus on financial risk, but there's many things the risk managers are looking at from an operational or cybersecurity, other parts of risk that our finance folks may not be focused on. Internal audit is adding that to their internal audit plan with more beefed up audit test plans this year, right? So your test plans last year might have been around testing the controls inside your enterprise system, your ITGC controls, for example. But this year, your IT auditors, especially as part of the internal audit team, may be looking at the spreadsheets that are invented this year to get through the pandemic, right? For us to be able to work remotely. Certainly, external auditors have heightened up this area. We talked to all of them, and some of them actually use SafePath, as you might know. And so they're telling us that we need to beef up these controls because we need to make sure that provided by client data is really validated. We're not going to just take it at face value, trust and verify. Process owners, so I'm going to focus on finance, but I've seen our clients bring up requests that are coming in from purchasing, from payables, from fixed assets, and even downstream from the operations, billing, collection systems, and so forth, where they're having to have better visibility and transparency and to be able to project their business moving forward. Certainly executives and boards as well, as these results are being reported, rolled up to the executives and boards. So in short, in a nutshell, everyone in the enterprise level is impacted. So it becomes, one of those risks that is on the list of every department and every individual involved with reporting results. So when we talk about these risks, we go and talk to our clients and we try to understand their pain points and talk to various groups or silos, if you will. And so what they're telling us is we don't have time, right? End of the audit, spreadsheets which is where most of their time is going. And what's happening is that end of the audit period is when people are making those adjustment entries because they're closing the books at the same time, and people are working from home and spreadsheets are being passed. So the time is not there by the time they get to the close. Other concerns are that we haven't had time to retest because we didn't think there were any changes made from last few years, but this year is different, right? So there are changes in certain accounts that mention goodwill and a few other accounts, asset accounts. where, this is an unusual year. So the areas where you didn't have to test previous year, you're having to test this year, but you're getting caught off guard because we didn't have changes previously to that. And they're missing changes. So the changes are being made in spreadsheets, but they're missing those because they're not being informed in a timely manner. And that's causing them significant findings and possible material weakness. We also check the changes before release, but they're not major enough to change the documentation. So, I mean, this is a judgment call we're making, and the auditors, external auditors especially, are saying, hey, you need to document those changes, even if you think they're minor, right? Because we may have an impact. A lot of minors add up to a major. So that's the frustration from the managers that are using spreadsheets and supporting whether those financial close process, like I said, or other processes like procure to pay, order to cash. And then we're talking to the auditors, the folks that review these spreadsheets, and here's what they're telling us. We'll always check the high risk spreadsheets, but the rest tend to get ignored. We'll do them all someday. So this is the year where they're putting more efforts in and looking at those spreadsheets that might have been ignored in the past, right? Because so much of the work is done in spreadsheets, and financial results and compliance is still a major concern. So some are essentially throwing their hands up and saying, look, we don't have the time to get through it all. And I'm hearing this more from internal audit that is overburdened with unusual number of controls to test, more complex audit plans, unexplained variations in financial results. And this is where those huge reputational risks occur, right? When you can't explain something that seems small, but then comes back and bites you and turns into you being in the cover of Wall Street or Financial Times. We often have to rely on users to tell us what calculation, and that's a classic problem we heard earlier, where somebody just cut and paste the wrong number, and just you take it at face value that it's correct, but there's actually an error in the formula. So an auditor can't test every cell in every spreadsheet, so they're relying on the source. And so you can see there's a story building here now, right, where the business managers are under pressure to get more done with less, working remotely, and the auditors are not quite ready to cover all the spreadsheet risk down to the cell level. So it kind of creates a perfect storm, and therefore a compelling event for us to talk about how to address these issues in 2020. So let's talk about a few techniques. And the way I want to talk about the techniques today is really give you some examples, anonymized examples, what I've heard from our clients this year. But before I get into that, let's just kind of take a look at, what are the risk mitigation approaches to mitigate risk in spreadsheets. So let's consider these best practices for today's session, and then the examples that I provide will make more sense on how we address the risk and what are the techniques we use. So first thing is, of course, risk discovery and assessment. So this is a fairly standard approach to looking at risk. Any IT system, spreadsheets are not unique in that way. So the flow is the same. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few of these highlights. These slides will be available for you to take these pointers and use them in your own business as you see fit. So first of all, you got to start with which are because there are too many spreadsheets. You got to start with what's important to your process that you're really relying on as part of your financial close process, for example. So if you're using that to do any work papers, assessments around your asset values, or your specific journal entries that you're having to make to kind of adjust for this year's budgets or projections or whatever that might be, those are your critical spreadsheets in finance, as an example. And then assess the risk associated with with those specific spreadsheets, and how do you control those spreadsheets. And hopefully you'll see how we make that simpler for you to control that risk. Recognizing when changes are made. So it's interesting that while changes are made throughout the period, there are certain changes, as we saw in the previous story about someone reporting that changes made at the end of the period tend to be higher. So there's a little bit of a trend analysis you can do and find out where are bulk of the changes coming in, and then pay more attention to those changes. Identify data dependencies. We talked about that cut and paste problem where something was tied to a formula that impacted 24 million. So take a look at those spreadsheets and assess, identify first of all which ones are in scope, right? And then what is changed, when is it changed? So really study those spreadsheets, and we'll find, like I said, we'll show you how SafePath has built some capabilities for you to make it simple so it's automated, because obviously it can be a full-time job to just monitor these spreadsheets. So once you know what the issues are, what you want to do is be able to correct those issues, obviously, and also look for fraud risk. When I've done a number of webinars with experts in fraud that are certified for fraud investigators and part of the bigger group, user groups and so forth. And one of the things they always say is, when times are tough where people lose their income or significantly lose resources or under stress, that's when fraud occurs. So take a look at those errors and figure out if those are just simple errors, or is there something behind those errors that leads to a bigger problem. And by preventing that, you can save your company's not only financial situation, but also reputation. Reconcile the data between separate sources of spreadsheets. So I'll provide you an example that one of our customers reported to us where, bank reconciliation, you got different treasury system than your general ledger, and they needed to do that, and spreadsheets weren't cutting it. So we'll give you an example of that in a minute. And there's another client that is using it for doing some security audits, which is also a very interesting example where spreadsheets can help you by using the controls we'll talk about. Then again, be alerted in real time when changes happen. So guess what? You don't have alerts in spreadsheets, right? We all know that. We use them all the time. So how do you address that remediation issue where specific changes to data? So again, we'll show you that in a minute, how we can help you do that in SafePath. Then the process compliance. Replace existing spreadsheet process with a more repeatable process. So that's kind of what you'll see in our case studies and our examples in a minute. So being able to essentially take that data, for example, again, sticking to our story with financial reporting. So if you're doing those journal entries from a spreadsheet, instead of just loading them straight through Web ADI into Oracle, and possibly your approval flags turned off as a profile option, and they go hit your financial statements, and things get missed and you have wrong results, you can actually load the data into SafePath through a spreadsheet in minutes, and it goes through the approver just like it does when you enter a journal entry inside your e-business suite or Oracle Cloud or whatever ERP you use. And then it goes through an approval audit trail just like it does, and I'll show you that in a minute. So automating that process so it's compliant, and it makes it easier not only for the process owner or the task manager that's managing that task for you, but also the ultimate auditor that reviews that behind these controls. So data and business logic is contained in Excel workbooks. So all this logic and flow can be now moved into a system from a spreadsheet that has that all locked down and with an audit trail on top of it. So process compliance probably where you can add the most value. Again, you got to take a risk-based approach here. So I'm not saying that for every spreadsheet you got to put a compliance process, but those that you're relying on to ensure the purpose of the process is met and those results are impacting your business, certainly take a look at those spreadsheets and take a risk-based approach. And then once you have this automated, then you got to put access controls around it. You got to put auditability and change controls around it, and monitoring of those controls. Again, we just talked about how spreadsheets can't be monitored, but once you bring the spreadsheets data easily into SafePath, then you have all these capabilities of SafePath that we're known for, access controls and monitoring controls. And then also the other thing is that spreadsheets are collaborating. Like one example I had with a customer, their close process starts in Singapore, then it goes to London, then it comes to New York. And collaboration in spreadsheets by just emailing spreadsheets is nearly impossible. And just it's become more compounded as people are spread out in those regions, even working from home or various offices spread across these countries. And so with this individual remote work model, the spreadsheets are just not cutting it anymore because there's no controls around it. So they're submitting those into SafePath, and then from there we put an audit trail on it. And then, of course, it's all on secure infrastructure that's SOC 1, SOC 2, battle tested every year. So, you don't have to do that spreadsheet audit that also is part of your audit plan and growing this year. So this is kind of an overall approach. Let's call it best practices, like I said, for remediation and mitigation of risk of spreadsheet. And now I'll demonstrate this with some examples on how you can get started with spreadsheets. So I picked an example of Oracle e-Business Suite, which, like I said, been around for a long time, and a number of our customers still use it, even though some are now moving to cloud and other things. So this tool has been there for at least 15 years that I've used, and you can see that it runs a macro through an upload, and it's a really handy tool to have for an auditor or for a finance person to go in and put this journal entry. The challenge our customers are reporting is that there are ways to switch on and off what happens once this entry is loaded, right? There's no audit trail. So there's a couple of risks on this specific slide. One is that I could put an entry that hits the account it should not hit. And secondly, it may or may not go through an approval. So now you've got some data coming straight into your general ledger, essentially an interface from a spreadsheet, which can result in a risk. So what these customers we're talking to are telling us that, hey, can you give us the ability to monitor when the spreadsheet is loaded? So we let people make their life easier, work from home, load the spreadsheet. But when it's loaded, we want to make sure that the data hits the right accounts. And so we want to monitor that. But we also want to see if we can replace that with a more controlled way of doing that. And I'll demonstrate that. So this itself is a toxic combination, this entry point. So because you don't have a lot of information, other than you do have the information about the user, but whether that user is allowed to enter data in this, and if they're entering data throughout the month, how many entries are made, where's the audit log? That's what's missing, right? So the benefit our customers reporting is by moving to SafePath, this step is to have that additional audit trail and approval that I talked about. I picked an example of Oracle Cloud. We have a customer using Oracle, several customers using Oracle Cloud now. They're moving from on-premise to cloud. Especially right now, there's a big demand for us to move to cloud because you have less people to worry about in terms of maintenance and so forth. So your cost of ownership is lower, and we're all looking to squeeze profitability and cash flow as the demand for products and services is significantly lower right now for many of our industries. So the ERP cloud enables you to do reconciliation by selecting accounts and checking that against the journal entries. So you take, and some customers have customized this. They have a report they get there from Treasury system, and they get it down to an Excel, then they upload it here, and they compare the journal entries. And that's where the errors are that are being reported and coming out in audit findings and the reconciliation process. So when you're reconciling everything within an ERP system, it's nice and good. But this year, especially, we're having to piecemeal information from many data sources. So you may be using a JP Morgan or Bank of America treasury system, which many of our customers in the US do. And same thing internationally, you have other bank systems for cash management, for treasury management function. So those systems generate their own data. And then you have the accounting systems like Oracle Cloud in this case. And you've got to make sure that the source data reconciles and the formulas are correct. So by using SafePath, our customers are able to validate that the source data is reconciled from their source all the way to Oracle Cloud. And I'll share some examples later. The third example I picked from Peoplesoft. You have a number of customers that are using Peoplesoft and JD Edwards and Workday and other systems. So I wanted to pick another example, and this is about supplier risk. So again, supplier customer risk is escalated. We are changing our supply chains to adjust for the pandemic and which suppliers are performing, maybe some that are not able to perform for various reasons. The medical, we did an event on medical supply chain just recently, and medical supply chain is the one that's front and center. Of course, most retailers are impacted. So when you're onboarding new customers and suppliers in these environments, you do a typical supplier check. If you're a financial institution where Peoplesoft's really popular in service organizations, so what we find in those organizations is the know your customer mandates, everything from AML protocols, Patriot Act, things like that, that you have to comply with in the financial industry specifically, that you've got to go in and go to the government site or third-party site that is hosted by, let's say, Dow Jones or Dun & Bradstreet, and you look at the data there, and then you compare the heuristics-based testing against the DUNS number in this example, or some other tax ID in the US. And then you make sure that they're not on some lists where you can't do business with them, your policies, so your company, your mandates from your regulatory bodies don't allow you to do business. So all of that checking is becoming a bigger burden as the supply chain is disrupted. So we provide you the ability to automate that process by comparing many data sources in one place. And some of those data sources might be in spreadsheets. So you're bringing data into spreadsheets, and you're uploading them into your master data portals, like your supplier portal, or your basic entry form there where you're manually entering the supplier details and then downloading that into an Excel or some other report that eventually turns into an Excel, and then comparing that spreadsheet against another Excel, so multi-data source, right, to validate that that tax ID doesn't have a hit against credit worthiness or other security risks that you have to comply with. So supplier risk is another key area that I'll talk about. This is an interesting example that was not on my radar, but one of our customers reported that they have had audit findings from their external auditor because the ServiceNow tickets where they're using ServiceNow to do user provisioning is not matching up with what's actually been provisioned in their ERP system. And that's a unique problem because now you've got two systems that don't talk to each other. ServiceNow doesn't, of course, provision users in an ERP system. It simply creates a ticket, somebody receives that ticket, and they manually enter that. And you can imagine with us working remotely that it's not as smooth as it might have been the past year. So the external auditors, the Big Four audit firm working, doing an audit, they looked at the listing of their provisioning system, in this case, ServiceNow, and then they compared that against what was provisioned, and they found gaps. And those gaps became findings. Findings got escalated to executives, and the customer came to us, and we have solved this problem for them by automating this process between ServiceNow and their ERP system. I also wanted to remind the auditors that follow us is that you may be using an audit tool like for SEC filing and testing samples. Workiva, for example, is a common product that I see some of our customers implementing or using for many years. And so this product is based, it came from the point of view that you can file your SEC reports directly from this tool, but actually the data comes into this tool through a spreadsheet, right? And same token, they also have the capability in this Workiva, and there are many other tools that do that. So I just picked an example where the auditors are required to do spreadsheet audits. So they're actually required to validate those important spreadsheets that are in the financial reporting process. And the testing of that spreadsheet itself has a test plan, and the test plan is based on randomized numbering and sample methodology that you have a consensus with your management and your external auditors. So all of that testing is happening in tools like Workiva, but they're relying on spreadsheets to begin with. And so being able to ensure that the data is controlled all the way from where it's exported from an ERP system and imported into a tool like an SEC filing tool like Workiva or an audit tool, that it's all, the integrity is maintained. It's all correct and it's not manipulated. That impacts the financial results or the auditability of those financial results under the PCAOB guidelines that were established by SOX 404 back in 2002, I think it was now. So yeah, so I mean, this is another example of something that you might be using. Now, many customers are doing that straight on the Edgar website, so, but the data eventually ends up to the public, in the public hand, through a spreadsheet or something like a spreadsheet. And so that's another touch point where the auditors are monitoring this process more closely. So I wanted to, like I said, show you a few examples, the practical examples of where SafePath is helping customers, and talk about a few techniques that our customers are following. So let's take a look at that now. So SafePath, as you know, has a complete safe enterprise. Essentially, it's got the piece to protect all pieces of your enterprise, ranging from your definition of policies and compliance down here to access management, which many of our customers have used for decades plus, and then more recently around monitoring data, data privacy, and then processing that data. So Data Guard is part of that data protection program where we specifically will talk about Excel today and guarding Excel, and then the analytics to have that assurance over the enterprise safeguards. So the way is Excel Guard as part of Data Guard, how that works is that you can either cut and paste the data into this space. So I can take any spreadsheet, just basically, let's say I have a task list for my financial close process. I can take that task list and cut and paste that here. And this is a really simple process because it automatically knows based on these separators and so forth, which you can configure, as you can see, and it creates an object in SafePath, which is then auditable and access controlled and change managed and all that good stuff that you'd be looking for. Or you can also do the old-fashioned way, just bring in a comma delimited CSV file, etc. So once you create an environment, you can then bring in these objects. So in this example, I also wanted to share with you that all the objects that are brought in have an audit log. So one of the challenges that we talked about with Spreadsheet is that, who changed what and what was the data provided by the client during that transition. In all those 5 use cases that I mentioned prior, you have that assurance lacking of that assurance, I guess, where the data came from. So by having Data Probe, which is the tool through which you load this data in SafePath, maintain a complete audit trail of the extraction, the amount of data extracted down to a log ID, gives your audit and your management the comfort level that the source from which the data is extracted is accurate, timely, and complete. So once this data is extracted, we talked about the common risks being the change, right? Data change. Any change that made to this data is going to be tracked. So you'll be able to see, first of all, you can't just go and make a change into a system like you can in a spreadsheet. But then if you do have to make a change, let's say you load a second snapshot of this data. So let's say the first snapshot had, this is a user listing that I used, and the second snapshot had a different listing. So you can see the differences between those two listings. And then you can monitor those differences. So you can see that I have the ability to monitor those changes across different setups between 2 different methods. Also, I have a workflow. So we talked about how people don't find out about changes, as one of the risk factors. So what Excel Guard will do is send out a workflow, and it's a 2-way workflow. This example, I picked journal sources. So if somebody has changed a journal source on the data entry through Web ADI and is posting into a wrong journal where it should not allow manual entries, I can get an alert. And it's more than an alert, it's a full closed loop workflow. So it captures that I've received it. So the historical record is added that I have received this workflow. And then the action that I take on it, you can see is down here. I can say approve or reject, as well as I can put my comments. So whatever action I take is also recorded. So now we have a complete change management process and an incident audit history logged on SafePath, which is where you keep all your audit history. So that's how you've protected the spreadsheet, by simply loading that into SafePath with a cut and paste, or an upload click and of the mouse within minutes. And then from there, You can share the data, you can compare the data, you can track changes, you can monitor changes. So all of those risk mitigation best practices that I talked about 15 minutes ago are now evidence in SafePath. Whether you're trying to load journal entries into your ERP system, set up new suppliers, make changes to your user provisioning process from your systems where users are provisioned to the systems, or your reporting results to the SEC using tools like Workiva. All of that data is now secured. There's an audit trail on when data came in, what was done with that data, and you can retire that critical spreadsheet that's impacting the risk, likelihood, and so forth in your process today. So for a case study, just to come to an end, I wanted to pick on an example of a customer that is using this capability to streamline their IT audit process. And it's a company with a global footprint with 115 countries where they have 30,000 plus restaurants. They use a number of Oracle, ServiceNow, and other IDMs to support their operations globally. And so some of the challenges that came out of our discussions were around complex and costly audit effort to reconcile the multiple sources, ledgers, etc. Time-consuming and error-prone testing process. So, I mentioned that provision system versus actual user access. Configuration challenges. As these systems are patched and updated, more and more is being done remotely. Being able to make sure that there's a common change management process and audit trail within the system that you're using to report results or run your operations. And then bottlenecks in the third-party risk, so supplier verification, customer, etc. So the success story here is that we are able to provide them a quicker way to complete their tasks, especially the financial staff, being able to perform the routine tasks with a check in SafePath that then translates into replacing that spreadsheet with a more automated workflow-oriented process, and which results in obviously the improvement of accuracy and reduction in the errors within their close process, period end process. Streamlining the third-party risks. Instead of doing the manual comparisons, once you load the information and connect SafePath with the ERP system, you have multiple data sources now. So you have a data source that might be going to Dun & Bradstreet or Dow Jones to capture that information about the risk of a third party, and then you have the information in your ERP system about the third party. So all that is now streamlined. When the risk occurs, it's investigated and addressed in a timely manner. And that's reducing the overall cost of not just the labor cost, but also the cost of doing business with third parties. Mitigating the risk of authorized use of services. So these are service accounts, whether it's in the ERP system or database or servers, being able to leverage that. And then applying these fine-grained contextualized audit history within that is not available in their entire ERP system, right? So being able to look at supplier bank account changes or journal source settings, manual to automated. And so that's another benefit of coming in. And ultimately, the bottom line is that last statement on the right, which is mitigate inherent ERP risks by automating embedded controls. So these controls are now embedded in the process through SafePath. And any time we detect any ERP changes or suspicious changes, misconfigurations, they're able to leverage SafePath for that, including changes in spreadsheets. So that's a quick case study I wanted to cover that addresses some of the use cases that I mentioned in prior slides. In the last few minutes, I think we're at the end, Emma. Do you have any questions from anyone? I know we've had quite a few people join. I can't hear you, Emma, if you're talking.
Sorry.
There you
Yes,
go.
we've had a couple of questions. We've had a couple of questions come in. The first one being, how can we load data into cloud ERP using SafePath?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so I'm actually working with a client just recently that is implementing Oracle ERP Cloud globally. They're in the energy business. And so they have the supplier data, which is exported from multiple sources. They're coming from multiple sources, and they want to load that into ERP Cloud. So we provide this tool called Data Probe, which has a bidirectional ETL. So I showed an example of that earlier, where it logs all the changes going up and down. So it's better than just loading the spreadsheet directly into an ERP system. And so yeah, they can basically use that capability to not only load the data, but also maintain exactly how many records were loaded, who loaded, any errors that happened that were manually corrected. So did somebody go and change the supplier bank account during that load process to match an employee bank account, which is a significant fraud risk. So this is happening today with our ERP Cloud customers, where they're coming in after the data is already loaded and asking us to run some look back analysis, which we can do also, but that's much costlier. So if you're implementing or moving to cloud, this is a great way to do it, is to do it right the first time as opposed to audit it in a reactive manner, which is significantly more costlier, not to mention the impact on your overall project and company. So yeah, that's one way to, great question. So that's one way to kind of improve your ability to interact with Oracle Cloud or whatever other ERP system you have, as long as we have the APIs, which we do for all the tier 1 systems. You can use SafePath to safeguard essentially that loading and exporting of data directly into the ERP.
Great. And can we use it to automate the end and audit close checklist and journal entries in the period end process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great use case for Excel Guard, as we saw today. So what customers, an example comes to mind, I think I touched on it earlier, company that starts their close process Singapore, then London, and then US, where they close the final books, corporate books. And so what they do is essentially we took their current, those spreadsheets, and as you saw in SafePath, you basically bring them in, and then there's a second step, which I didn't have time to show, but we have a financial close webinar. If you want to go, it must be recorded on our resource page, take a look at it. But what that does is basically takes these tasks of whether it's journal entry or adjustments or estimation, and sends it out to the preparers, in the close process. Those preparers can then close those tasks, complete those tasks, and there's a nice dashboard that you can get so the executives can see where we are. Are we 50% close? Are we 70% close? Because guess what? You still have that disclosure guideline from the SEC to make sure that numbers are reported in a timely manner, not to mention accurate and so forth. So you've got to be able to do all that in the same amount of time as it was last year, but now you've got all these people working remotely. So this customer is looking at streamlining that process by loading these spreadsheets, assigning those tasks, and then as those tasks are completed, journal entries are completed, period end processes run, that it's all recorded, and the audit trail is right there. So when the auditors come behind the finance group and say, okay, did you complete this work paper? Did you check this estimated account? Did you apply this top entry? All of those steps are marked completed. And if there's a gap, of course, it's real world, people make mistakes, that you can catch that before you get to the financial statement results that are filed through your system. So yeah, great questions. Those two are great questions. Anything else, Emma, before we wrap up?
No, I can't see any other questions that have come in today, but if you do have any questions that crop up, then please don't hesitate to contact me. You have my details there on the screen. So thank you to everybody for attending. You'll all be receiving the recording in an hour or so. And if you would like a copy of today's presentation deck, then also feel free to reach out to me. So thanks for joining, and hopefully we'll see you again on September 23rd. when we have a panel discussion around GRC past and present, where you can find information on our events page on our website. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Adil. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.